All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Peter Lipsett, Vice President at Donors Trust. Welcome to Free the Economy, Peter.
Thank you, Richard.
So we're here to talk about being generous, about charitable giving, and all the implications of that. Uh, so your organization is there to help people who want to be charitable and do it in the smartest way. What's your sort of elevator pitch? You meet someone who's a potential donor. They say, you know what, I want to kind of like donate some money to some charitable causes out there, but I don't even know how to go about it. Why should I work with you guys?
Yeah, well, there's lots of people who want to be generous, and there's also increasingly a lot of people who are concerned about the right way to do that, particularly in this era where big banks, where there's outrage mobs, where people even have their own children working against the conservative libertarian ideals that we care about, that we might want to donate to. And Donors Trust really exists to be a counter to that, to be a aligned, principled vehicle and principled partner for donors who are conservative, libertarian, care about those issues, and want to make sure that they can do their giving in a way that's simple, flexible, and tax advantaged, but above all, aligns with their principles of limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise.
Yeah, we've certainly heard plenty of stories of families, even in the very wealthiest families that are have the most capacity to give, where there ends up being a kind of like generational split between the conservative grandparents and the communist grandchildren about where they want the family money to go. And so it makes sense that if you're the generation that made the money, you might want to worry about making sure that the any sort of like future dispersals of that money goes in a direction that you're comfortable with. But so you guys are focusing on, like you said, sort of liberty movement, conservative, libertarian kind of causes and directions, but there's certainly other organizations out there that have that the sort of the opposite orientation. There's plenty of organizations that are specifically looking at progressive kind of left wing causes as well, right?
Right. I mean, Donors Trust, to a certain extent, was founded as a response to the Tides Foundation out in San Francisco that was really built to support progressive causes and continues to do so today. And then now you have Arabella Advisors has a whole little network of different liberal, progressive donor advised funds that it's doing, pumping all kinds of dollars out into that. But, they say the opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy. And frankly, over the past few years, we've had a lot of concern about some of the groups that are ostensibly neutral when it comes to kind of an ideological alignment, the Fidelity Charitables and the big bank or organized donor advised funds, Goldman Sachs's fund, and some of the community foundations that ostensibly will give anywhere, or maybe have a geographic focus, but have also come out against some of the principles that folks who are going to listen to this podcast probably would agree with.
Well, yeah, and before we kind of get into like the weeds of sort of mechanics of how that works, one thing I've often read comparing the U.S. to other countries. A lot of times people will say, "Oh, well, look at Europe. They have free healthcare and they have social welfare programs, and we like, they like Europe better for those reasons." But one of the things that is sort of exceptional about America, besides its you know economic growth and dynamism, is that Americans tend to donate to charitable causes at higher rates than pretty much anywhere in the world, I think. And there's a huge organized infrastructure, which you kind of mentioned, a few elements of that involve um, facilitating, advising, helping people do those donations. There's a massive volume of money that gets donated here more than in other places. Why do you think that is? Is it Americans? Are there Americans just more generous? Is it just part of our DNA?
I do think it's baked into the cake from the beginning. Essentially, we were rare as a rare thing on earth. We were a country that broke apart from from the its overlord right across the sea and said, no, 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 we want to do things our own way. And in fact, I mean, even before we broke apart, the people that were coming here were people who said, no, I think I'll do it my way. And so we have this go it alone ethos right from the start. And really, I would say it's not just a go it alone ethos, it's a go it with community ethos. We started particularly with, Puritan churches or different religious groups, and then we bonded in social groups. We have always had this way of looking inward to our community instead of upward to a king or to some higher power, higher secular power that would have the answers for us. And so I really do think it is baked in the cake to look to our communities to support it, which turns into charitable giving, it turns into volunteerism, it turns into giving those time, talent, and treasures to help other people and not just sitting and waiting for the government to come along.
Excellent point. Now, you mentioned in sort of summarizing what groups like Donors Trust do, um, one of the things they do is take it, uh, steer people towards the tax advantages that are built into the tax code. So you have, so in like a nonprofit like here us at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, we sort of have a double tax advantage because we operate as a nonprofit. So we don't pay the equivalent of like a corporate income tax the way business do, but we also are able to receive donations that are tax advantaged for the person giving them to us. So it's interesting the way that there's multiple ways in which nonprofits are kind of supported by the tax code and current laws. How big of a role does that play, do you think, in people's decision to donate or to donate to at certain times or certain places? Because there's certainly people who've been very cynical and say like, oh, well, rich people donate money, but it's just for the tax write-off. That's all they care about.
Yeah, does it matter at the margins? Absolutely. I mean, anything that incentivizes anything is gonna nudge people one way or the other. But, as our CFO likes to point out, you don't give away a dollar so that you can save 33 cents. Like that's a bad financial deal. You do it because you have some kind of charitable intent. You care about what you're giving to. And there's a lot of talk that the Trump tax cuts back in 2017 with the raising of the standard deduction may have changed some of that incentives. That's again probably right at the margin, but it's really hard to tell if it's correlation or causation. I think the bigger thing with tax advantage and the tax benefit that you can get from donating and where organizations like CEI, organizations like Donors Trust, where we have a role to play in talking to donors, is to help all of us see that by leveraging the tax advantages that are there for the taking, we can actually give more than we otherwise might. And so I can write CEI a $500 check, but if I give you $500 worth of stock, that actually I can get the same tax benefit ostensibly and from a deduction side, but I can also give away my cost basis and right and not have to pay capital gains taxes. And there's all kinds of little things like that where you can be strategic in how you give and also give more. And I think a lot of the criticism stops at you can be strategic and misses that actually allows people to be more generous than they otherwise might.
Yeah, that $500 gift of stock is a good idea. We'll talk. We'll seal that down at the end of the interview. Uh, make it real. You know, so one other aspect of this, I think that is sort of where the narrative is different from the reality is that there's a lot of attention, a lot of sort of earned media, you would say, when it comes to really wealthy people giving big chunks of money away. So if that's Bill Gates or Mackenzie Bezos or whoever, the biggest money people are out there, or someone writes a check for $50 million to Harvard or UCLA or whatever. People notice that, but that's not the whole world of charitable giving. There's plenty of less rich, almost everyone's less rich than that, but there's a lot of like people who maybe don't even think they're quote rich, who nevertheless donate significant amounts of money, certainly percentage wise, and there are options for them as well, other than just writing $50 to NPR to get the tote peg.
Yeah, it's true in one hand that about 66% or so more or less of total giving comes from smaller dollar, middle dollar donors, from people who are giving away less than $1 million, right? The problem with the story is that that number is declining, that there is a lot more coming from the top. And again, a lot of people blame that on the Trump's tax cuts. I don't think that's quite right. I think that's just a fact that because fewer people are itemizing, it's easier to see those numbers. But there does seem to be some kind of disincentivization of the smaller and mid-sized donors. They are disappearing. Fewer people are giving. And my thoughts on this, and I share this with others, is uh, on one hand, we're over celebrating some of the major gifts, and a lot of fundraisers are putting too much emphasis on raising dollars from major gifts because if I can raise two $500,000 gifts, that sure is a lot faster than raising even four $250,000 gifts or, down the line. And so the more money I can raise in one swoop, the better. That's great. So we over celebrate those, and those are, but on the flip side, we have a lot of legislators and social activists demonizing those same major givers, particularly if they give to things that they don't like, right? McKinsey Scott Bezos doesn't necessarily get a lot of that demonization because she gives to things that the mainstream progressive left likes, but others don't necessarily get that. And so, and the risk isn't to the big charities either. The top 100 charities last year, for example, saw a 4% increase in what they're giving, even as giving across the board went down. And so, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Charles Koch, these people aren't writing gifts to your local food bank or to the local theater company or even to the small research hospital in your community. They're giving to these big things. And that's why it's so important that, and I don't know what the right answer is, but the middle class, lower classes, people with less money to give continue to give because those smaller organizations that really are the backbone of the country need them.
Yeah, and probably the top category of organizations that people with lower incomes donate to is probably their local church, right? There's a lot of
Right.
people who tithe, um, and don't necessarily think about, well, they're not going to write a big check to Sloan Kettering Medical Center, but they're going to, donate to the coffee hour fund, for after services. And I wonder if there's a way to get people to think that same way a little outside of the church in to the like local community groups you sort of mentioned. That I know when I lived in College Park, Maryland, I did a little bit of work trying to encourage people to do, like local donations, and we were trying to sort of steer donations to projects that were so small they weren't even incorporated, like they didn't have the taxpayer identification number, they don't have a bank account, they're so tiny, they just need, to like reimburse some volunteers for stuff. And because that stuff never makes it into the stories about billionaires writing big checks, I think people sometimes almost forget that those organizations are out there. And the big thing as far as you know uh having an impact, um bigger dollars on average of course have more of an impact than smaller numbers of dollars, but as a percentage of a total charitable organization's budget, uh you're gonna have a lot more impact donating to your local Meals on Wheels chapters than you are to some big national charity with $100 million budget.
Right. You need those smaller dollar donors to be engaged. I'm on the board of an organization, the Frontier Culture Museum down here in Western Virginia. And those small donors matter not just because, that helps underwrite a lot of things, but because it's museums like that or some of the other places that you mentioned need physical bodies to come and make them valuable. They need people to come. And so if there's charitable dollars supplementing attendance, and those two kind of have some overlap, well, that makes the organization and the community thrive even more. So 100% on everything you said.
And so, you've already kind of gotten into a little bit of this about how these the trends in charitable giving have changed over the years and change you've seen. So obviously, we've got some very obvious ones that everyone used to write a paper check and send it in to their favorite charity, and then you would have to hire someone to open all the envelopes and scan all the checks and and do all the accounting, and it's much more online forms these days. But I wonder also about the rise of organizations like Donors Trust, which again we sort of hinted at the very beginning, that are what are called donor advised funds, right? Where you take some money and you give it to this organization, and they hold it in an account, and then they kind of like help you disperse it, and then they deal with all the like paperwork and all that kind of stuff. Um, how much sort of growth has there been in people going that way? People who give enough that they have a sort of account like that with an organization like Donors Trust.
Yeah, you really. in people's minds, there were two ways to give for a long time, and probably still today for a lot of people. There is the checkbook giving, like you say, or there is a private foundation, right? And the super rich people have private foundation, and all the rest of us did checkbook giving. And the donor advised fund is really, even though it's been around for several decades now, has really risen as a model that more and more people are using. In fact, most donor advised funds accounts, some recent research suggests, has less than $50,000 in it. $50,000 is not chump change, but it's also not the millions of dollars that's in so many private foundations. It's much more obtainable for being able to be a tool that people can give with. And I think that's a fact that people miss. And so as people want to get more strategic about their giving, be more systematic about it, take advantage of those tax advantages, there is this rise in people turning to a donor advised fund who say, I want to have some systems, but I'm not going to open a private foundation. I don't need to create a board. I don't need tax filings every year. That sounds like a lot of work. But the donor advised fund offers this middle opportunity. And couple that with the fact that many financial firms are offering it, they create a pretty good sales and marketing team for the idea of a donor advised fund. And then you have groups like Donors Trust that can come along and say, you understand this concept. Now you also need to think about your donor intent and your values and make sure all of those are in alignment.
Because you also have an outreach component to get people in the door when they're younger, right? Because there is this kind of assumption, which is true for a lot of people, which is they go out and they make a bunch of money. They have a successful career. Maybe they start their own company. Maybe they're just a successful executive. And then when they're 65 and they retire, then they're like, oh, well, maybe I should do some donating, right? Whereas obviously a lot of people in the charitable world would like to say, no, 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 you should get started earlier, start thinking about when you're 30 or, when you're, uh, and maybe your donations will be smaller, right, at a younger age. But you should sort of like get into the habit of giving if it's something that you agree is a good idea. Most people would say, yeah, you're right, I should do that, but oh, I'm busy. And so tell me about the sort of like recruiting the younger generation of givers.
Well, you use the magic word, which is habit. And it's one of the drums I bang all day long that charitable giving really is a habit. And it's one that so many of us first saw when we were in church and our parents put money in the collection plate as it passed down the aisle, or maybe they were in the Rotary or the Kiwanis Club and they saw mom and dad being involved in volunteer activities and giving some dollars to it, giving their time to it. As those social groups, as church attendance have fallen off, the habit is just a little less evident. But you're right. We still need that next generation of givers to rise up, and they are there. Maybe not every one of them, but the ones that are engaged are really engaging and they look for impact. And so we did found something called the Novus Society, which is our program for donors under 40 to help them build that habit because we do think it's so important and to set them up with a donor advised fund, but more importantly, surround them with these ideas of how do you make charitable giving a habit? How do you put money away every month so that you can have a little nest egg and give out of assets instead of just giving out of whatever cash happens to be in your bank account? How do you get connected to people who've been doing this for a little while and have thought through this? How do you go from giving 10 groups $100 to really honing in on two groups that you want to give $500 or more to in a strategic way? Going back to that stock example. And so all of those little things are things that people learn often when they have more time, which is why so many donors are, 65 and older. All of a sudden, they've got a little more time to think about this stuff. But there are a few things at the margin that you can start doing when you're younger, or, then don't want to turn off the 45, the 50, 55-year olds who are listening and still very active in their careers. There's still ability to carve out just a little bit of time to think strategically about this. And that's where having a vehicle like a donor advised fund can be helpful because it just makes you think intellectually, yeah, I'm a little sophisticated on this. And I think, being able to pull on your suspenders and say, yeah, I know what I'm doing is a big thing. And it allows you to ultimately give more again. That point again. The goal of a lot of this isn't just to give, it's to be able to give more and have more impact over time.
Yeah, I think you can also really see how high the average age of engagement is for something when you see where the cutoff is for the young person's version of it, right? So for some people, the young person's version is like if you're a high school student or if you're a college student or if you're under 25. And I've blown through most of those limits myself, but
Right.
in terms of like so if anyone under 40 is still the young person's version, that's obviously something that has, the main the most engaged people are definitely older. Um, and so here's a big one that I think has been, controversial. It's talked about a lot. And so the idea is about privacy and whether people should be giving anonymously, and whether if you were, especially if you're donating to anything that's sort of like associated with politics, whether it's bad to be donating anonymously, right? So, on the one hand, there's the idea, which is, don't do your praying in public. Go into your private room and do it quietly. You shouldn't show off, right? So maybe that's the reason why some people would donate anonymously, is because they don't want to feel like show-offs. But then people say, oh, well, some of these philanthropic donations actually affect politics and public policy, and therefore we should demand transparency. And no one should even be allowed to donate anonymously because we got to know, because it's all about, it's affecting democracy. And so there's this sort of, push and pull about uh, privacy versus transparency, and serious competing, arguments on either side. And when it comes to this, I remember an interview I did several months back uh, with People United for Privacy, and their big thing is, of course, privacy. And Brian Hawkins told me privacy is for individuals, transparency is for government, right? And so, yes, transparency can be an important thing, but that's a requirement we should put on government and politicians. When it comes to individuals, we should be regarding their privacy. How do you guys approach that as as a group that like facilitates these kind of donations?
Yeah, we very much agree with the People United for Privacy line there about transparency being for government and privacy is for people. That matters. And and transparency goes, the reason that your contributions to a candidate kind of get swept up into that transparency camp is because they're ultimately working to elect somebody, a legislator who's going to vote on things that you don't get to control at the end of the day, right? That government, as CEI is certainly well aware, is the gun pointed to our head, to use the violent metaphor of it, right? Government is not something you can opt out of. And so that transparency matters because every dollar going in has a direct effect on us. Turn that around to the philanthropic landscape. And yes, you can argue that, these big charities have impacts in our lives, but frankly, there's some research that suggests a lot of people don't think they do. And if I'm a private donor to an anti-abortion cause, that's my choice and my right. And frankly, if you're pro-abortion, you can just ignore that charity. You can ignore it, and you can ignore me. You don't, yes, there will be a conversation, all that. You could say, it's part of the ethos, but at the end of the day, you get to make your own decisions. I get to make my own decisions. And, it goes back to the invisible hand, the idea of a spontaneous order of giving, as I like to say, that causes that you care about may not be the ones I care about, but we need all of them to create a thriving community. But if you want to do one thing and I want to do other, I don't necessarily need to know that you want to do it. And there's religious reasons for people wanting to be private. There are just people who don't like to have the light shined on them. And whatever the reason is, that should be a right that people are allowed to do. We have the right to free speech, and our dollars are free speech. Our philanthropy is free speech. But part of the right of free speech is the right to shut up and the right to not say anything, or right to not necessarily have your views broadcast. And I think that's why it's so important to have the ability to give anonymously or give out loud, however you want, when it comes to the philanthropic world.
Yeah, and you have the right to broadcast, but to broadcast anonymously as well. I mean, a lot of people remind us when this topic comes up that the Federalist Papers, the one of the biggest guides to our Constitution and what it meant by the people who wrote it and arguments for it, those were basically newspaper op-eds that were published anonymously or pseudonymously, right? Um, uh, Anonymous speech in American history is very important. It can be very powerful, and it's something that you should have the ability to do precisely because you are arguing about politics and important things. I think the argument um, that well, anything that's important that has a political impact has to be disclosed, but only unimportant things we can say, oh, well, they're allowed to be anonymous because they're not important enough to for anyone to care about or to impact anything. Well, no, that's of course that's not the real argument. Uh, it is precisely the most important stuff in which anonymity is often the most important. And when I talked to, like I said, with that interview with, Brian Hawkins, we talked about the famous court case of NAACP versus Alabama, where the state of Alabama back in the 50s, there was a lot of civil rights activism going on. They wanted the state chapter of the NAACP to disclose their donor list, and it was very obvious why the racist government officials, who were the then current government officials, wanted to do that because they wanted to harass the people who were in favor of greater civil rights for all Americans. And so that same thing happens today, where rather than counter donate to an opposite cause or counter argue to the cause you don't like, some of these demands for to unmask the anonymity of donors are simply because they want to harass the people who are donating to the causes they believe in. Um, and and so even if it is political, I mean, I have my own particular view of how federal elections should be regulated. I would probably get rid of a lot of those disclosure requirements myself if I could wave the magic wand. But I just don't want, people to get the impression that, if it's something that has an impact on politics, then it has to be disclosed. But only for things that don't have any meaningful impact. That's what, privacy is for. No,
Right.
privacy is for the most important stuff.
Right.
So, and there's a lot of, angles we can go down about, politically controversial people making donations that then generate more controversy. But you know the I think some people on the left are still living in sort of like a 1890s Gilded Era version of Marxist social theory, where anyone with any money is right wing, and anyone who's left wing is sort of part of the proletarian masses. Where if that was ever true, it's certainly not true today. And some of the very wealthiest people in the world are donating to the farthest left causes, right? So, uh, being sort of pro billionaire or anti billionaire is no longer a meaningful proxy for being, right wing or left wing or anything like that. For every Charles Koch, there's a George Soros. Um, and I I feel like they sort of balance each other out. They don't cancel each other out because they're giving different money to different things. But that it's not simply the case, which I feel like a lot of kind of left-wing commentary suggests, that, oh, we just got to crack down on these billionaires and their like charitable giving and how it affects politics, and that'll be good for our side. I feel like there's just as many, if not more dollars, like you said, maybe Mackenzie Bezos is an example, um, pushing political causes to the left as to the right. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would not say that they balance each other out. The left absolutely swamps the right. And there's just no question about it that the left is very good at pointing to the right, as you say, and saying, "Oh, look at all the terrible things they do." But it's very much Wizard of Oz pretending that there's nobody behind the curtain. And there's a lot of rich people behind that curtain who are putting a lot of money into leftist causes, sometimes quietly, sometimes very loudly. And all the time in this, frankly, gaslighting way of, no, we're not doing anything. We're just trying to help the people. But, the Charles Kochs and the people on the right, they're screwing everything up. And, I wish I had some numbers at my fingertips of some great work that Capital Research Center has done to lay out some of these numbers. But, it could be worth talking to Scott Walter over there at some point on your show of just how different the numbers really are when you take in all the different factors. And so, do they balance out? No, absolutely. We have an uphill fight. The nice thing is, our ideas are really good. And I know it's cliche to say, well, our ideas are great, and that doesn't mean anything if nobody hears them. That's why it's so important that we have, not just the Charles Kochs, but the John Tomasis or the smart nonprofit leaders or the good mouthpieces out there who are pushing these ideas of limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise, and the things that we really believe in. Because uh, I think with my whole heart that people, when they really weigh the arguments, that is more the direction they want to go. Sure, they want to get free stuff. Sure, there's some things on the left that are really appealing. But at the end of the day, our ideas can win because they're good ideas. They're ideas that people feel in their bones. And the challenge is A, getting them out there, but more importantly, the challenge is not being gaslit by all of the big funders on the left to have those ideas just swept under the rug.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting how obviously donations to controversial political causes get attention because the causes themselves are controversial, but even the act of donating or refraining from donating itself can get pulled into these big hot button issues. And I think about the debates that are happening about like free speech on campus, on university campuses, but like Harvard and Columbia. We've certainly seen a lot of coverage there of those two places. And so you have donors, previous donors and potential future donors, who seem to be more aggressive these days about, donating even to their own alma mater. You have people like Bill Ackman at Harvard, who's written a lot about free speech and activism on campuses and his view of like what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. Um, where I feel like the sort of like blue chip way of, giving charity has been to, if you went to a big famous university, you give money to that big famous university because it's a high status thing and you're a high status guy. And then, after enough donations, they put your name on a plaque and they invite you to a reception and everyone, it's all great and wonderful. Um, but I feel like some of these people, especially who have been very successful in their own generation producing wealth, are saying, you know what, I'm not just gonna write that check to Harvard or Yale or Princeton every year. I'm actually gonna look really closely at what the Board of Trustees has decided about important things like free expression on campus. Um, what is it like for you as someone who just sort of like works every day doing the sort of like nuts and bolts of making the stuff work? When these sort of like really hot button issues pop up, and like do you have people like calling, texting, emailing you saying like, hey, I want to be the Bill Ackman of Southwestern State University, or how do I get my alma mater's trustees to listen to me, or how do I even like weigh in on any of this stuff?
Well, it is an important thing to try to keep the pulse of. And when something like this pops up, more and more donors are waking up to the fact that they actually can do something that at a minimum, just stop giving to the bad stuff, but more importantly, start redirecting the charitable capital into other better causes. And one of the things we try to do is try to understand what some of those other better causes are. You're seeing this proliferation of free speech places on campuses at Bucknell and MIT, at my alma mater at Davidson. There's a whole network of them now that are really creating these alternative organizations that donors can give to that, in some cases may be affiliated with the school, but generally are independent, but are helping the school. They're helping the dialogue on school. They're actually moving the needle in ways that the administration is never going to get around to. And, donors who are smart and sophisticated and really care about the outcome and maybe still care about their school are not going to feel too bad about no longer being part of the giving society that the school had set up because they're making real change at the school in other ways. And so it's, as these issues come up, one of the things we look at and one of the things more and more donors want to know is how do they circumvent it? How do they still use their dollars in a smart way? And I think that's really important. But frankly, with the higher ed stuff in particular, one of the big obstacles right now continues to be just getting them to turn off the spigot, just stop giving first and then figure out something else. But there's a lot of donors who are like, well, I'll go down to just giving a modest gift. Don't give anything. It's a black hole.
Well, yeah, and I think that, you know, that sort of brings us back to, you know, what is this all about? And, you know, it's really about advancing the values to people who have money to give. And, you know, I think this is something that gets kind of misunderstood sort of like in the fundraising world, especially in, you know, the sort of nonprofit fundraising world. It's a little bit different with alma maters because, you know, people have already have a connection there. Um, which is you know, the idea, and I've talked to people who say like, oh, I can never go into fundraising because then you just have to like harass people for money all the time. And they're like, that would be awkward and unpleasant, and I couldn't do that. And I think it's kind of the wrong idea about what all of this world is like. I think it's much more about connecting people with money to the opportunities that they are going to find interesting. It's not about harassing someone until they give you money, because among other things, that's unlikely to be a very successful fundraising technique, right? And so there's a certain kind of like concierge advisor kind of relationship here. I feel like where, you know, as a sort of like a successful fundraiser, the idea is to find people who have a value connection with whoever you represent, and then try and seal that deal, not to yell at people until they give you money.
Right, right. Nobody gives to needs, right? Nobody gives to weak T plans. They give to big visions, and they give because more often than not, they care about a cause, an outcome, not so much the organization. Like if your organization is working towards that outcome, then your organization is a good one to give to on that front. And but it doesn't preclude them from giving to somebody else. You know, CEI does a lot of great work on regulations, but so do a few other groups. And so somebody who really cares about changing the regulatory environment probably gives to 3 or 4 groups in that front. And fundraisers have a role to play in helping donors to achieve that big ends because that's their job anyway. That's the organization's job. It's one of the great things that we get to do at Donors Trust. It's why we have a podcast as well called Giving Ventures, where we try to highlight a number of these different groups because we know that if a donor really cares about uh, educational opportunities at K-12, then they want to know the landscape of groups, not just that one group is where they should give all their money. And maybe one of the groups will rise to the top for them, and that's great. Goes back to that spontaneous order of giving. But they want to change the world. They don't want to just fund an organization. And I think fundraisers who fail to understand that are doing a disservice to the donor and to the organization that they work for.
All right. Well, we've changed a little part of the world right here today, Peter. Thank you so much for being with us. Before we go, tell people where they can find you and that other podcast that you mentioned, which is fantastic, by the way.
Well, you can learn more about Donors Trust at donorstrust.org. And anybody who is a giver in some capacity, I hope you'll at least check it out and try to understand the donor advised fund model. If you're already using a donor advised fund and it's not Donors Trust and you believe in these principles of libertarian conservative ideas, then you owe it to yourself to better understand how Donors Trust can fit in. And we do have this podcast called Giving Ventures. You can find that wherever you can find podcasts, and we cover all sorts of issues there that will help give you, as a donor, a better insight into the landscape of good free market policies that are and organizations that are going on out there.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you.